I'm a grown man now, and this is my first time sharing my story. I remember the line before I ever heard it on the television. They thought I'd disappear quietly. Instead, I made headlines. It felt like prophecy the first time it left my mouth, a sentence that would outlive the quiet life I'd been careful to keep. The boardroom smelled like cold coffee and regret that morning. Glass walls, polished tables, and the kind of silence that pretends to be dignity. I stood near the doorway and watched the scene arrange itself into something I had only ever seen in private nightmares. Robert Hale was at the center of it, red-faced and furious, barking into a phone like a man trying to throw his voice and the blame at anyone who would take it. His tie was crooked, his composure brittle. He had ruled the analytics floor for years. Melissa Crane hovered behind him like a practiced smile with teeth. She was a deputy who knew how to laugh at the right time and stab at the right one. Her sympathy toward others had always been a costume. Now it sat awkwardly on her shoulders as the cameras rolled. Nexora Analytics logo pulsed on every screen in the room as if the brand was a heartbeat being squeezed by the news cycle. For a company that sold itself on clarity, that day it felt like smoke and mirrors, a trick of optics that had been hiding rot for years. I had spent a decade translating chaos into rows and columns. Numbers were my refuge. When the world felt inscrutable, a spreadsheet gave me rules and a way forward. I measured truth in decimal places and dates until the truth I thought I knew began to fracture along neat, fearful lines. I am not loud by nature. I prefer to be precise. I prefer to make my point, and then let the evidence do the arguing for me. That was my method at Nexora. Keep your head down, your margins clean, and your reports impeccable. At first the oddities were almost laughable, the sort of small errors a tired accountant or a late intern could make. Missing invoices here, strange fees there, tiny discrepancies that could be written off as human error until the pattern refused to be accidental. I remember the spreadsheet that started the whole thing, little gray cells and small numbers that hummed in my peripheral vision late one night in an empty office. I flagged a line, then another, then stitched them together into a concern that felt both rational and urgent. I emailed the findings to Robert. I kept the tone professional, clinical. I attached charts, pivot tables, and an appendix of references. I expected a thank you and an audit. Instead, I got a smile and a promise to handle it, the way kings promise reform and do nothing. A week later, HR called me in for a discussion. The door shut behind me like a trap. The language they used was surgical. Performance inconsistencies, conduct concerns, phrases meant to numb and obfuscate. They had already written the conclusion they wanted and were looking for a script to deliver it. The performance review that awaited me was a fabrication dressed in corporate understatement, missed deadlines that never happened, sloppy analysis that contradicted years of clean work, a narrative stitched from convenient lies. They made me the problem so the problem would be buried with me. The team meeting felt like a theater of cruelty. Robert announced my departure as a restructuring, a business necessity. He used a voice that promised regret and resolution while the room absorbed his lines like moths to a poisonous lamp. Melissa clapped like an actor finishing a scene. Security escorted me through hallways that suddenly seemed unfamiliar, as if the building itself had turned against me. A guard's hand on my elbow, my laptop taken, my badge deactivated, small rituals of erasure performed with bureaucratic efficiency. They wanted me gone, wiped from their ledger. I left with a cardboard box of my things and a head full of questions. I told no one how cold the elevator seemed on the way down, or how the weight of that box felt heavier than it should. My career, a decade of modest integrity, had been reduced to a quiet dismissal and a rumor. The first days after were a fog. I drank too much coffee in the morning and too much silence in the evening. Shame and anger braided together like a double helix, each feeding the other. I tried to be normal, to apply for jobs, to pretend this was a small detour. Then the ping came. It was small, almost trivial. A notification that my personal cloud backup had synced an old folder I'd forgotten to exclude. I wasn't expecting anything important. I was still raw and unready for what I found when I opened that dated file. The spreadsheet that resurrected itself held a different story from the one I'd been shown. Transactions were logged with dates and references, vendor names that didn't resolve, payment trails that looped back in peculiar ways. The numbers were patient, waiting to be read correctly. As I traced the columns, the pattern sharpened. Shell vendors, fuzzy consulting line items, reallocated contract funds disappearing into accounts that served no obvious purpose. It wasn't an accident. It was a design. A quiet siphon siphoning millions from contracts, while Nexora kept its public smile. My hands shook when I saw the signatures and authorizations tied to the spends. Robert's initials were there in dispatch memos and approved invoices. A flagged transfer bore Melissa's email, and deeper in the logs, other names surfaced, suits from finance and procurement who had learned to make discretion their currency. The realization that my termination was not punishment but protection slammed into me with the force of a freight train. I had been made the fall guy so the real thieves could keep their seats. They had cleaned the footprints by clearing out the one person who had noticed them. I could have let it go. I could have burned the bridge and found another job. That would have been sensible. But the thought of them continuing, of investors blind to the leak, of colleagues complicit in silence, was a weight I could not drop. My anger took on the shape of purpose, so I started to build a case quietly and with method. My first steps were mundane. Download everything I could from memory, salvage old emails, copy the backups. I cataloged logs, emails, and versions. I wrote notes to myself like a detective marking time and motive. I read whistleblower statutes until my eyes blurred. I learned how protections worked, what evidence mattered, how chains of custody could be maintained. Knowledge felt like armor. The more I understood, the less reckless my anger became, and the more precise my plan got. I set up anonymous accounts behind layers of encryption. I made offline copies stored in places that could not be traced back to me. I rehearsed the story in my head, laying out a timeline and the clear pieces that would make the narrative undeniable. Proof, I decided, would be my revenge. Claire Duval was the reporter I chose. She had a reputation for tenacity and a nose for corporate rot. The Herald Ledger had run her pieces before, pieces that made executives sweat and regulators ask awkward questions. I opened a burner email and began the slow, awkward process of trust building at a distance. My first correspondence with Claire was careful. No accusations, only questions and a sample of data that hinted at a much larger problem. She responded with professional curiosity and a request to see more. I fed her fragments until she asked for the whole puzzle. Then I handed it over. I sent her the spreadsheets, the logs, the emails, and the trail of vendors that led nowhere. I included notes I had made, pointing out the keys and the quirks. I organized the information like an analyst preparing a briefing, clear, annotated, and impossible to dismiss with a single phrase. I also sent an anonymous package to Nexora's board. No fanfare, no threats, just a clean, professional dossier with attachments and a succinct cover letter outlining the evidence and the risk the company faced if it did not act. I wanted the board to know that this was not rumor. It was a crystallized account. The next weeks were a study in patience and tension. I watched from the outside as Claire dug deeper. I watched as auditors, those slow, methodical sorts, started to show up at Nexora's doors. The air shifted. Whispers replaced confident stride. I felt both relief and dread as the machine I'd exposed began to move. Breaking news alerts arrived like thunder. Tech firm under investigation. The banners screamed. The push notifications felt surreal, as if I were watching a film in which I had an unexpected cameo. Claire's article was precise and damning, laying out the plain numbers alongside the names and the paths the money had taken. Nexora's stock reacted like a living thing in pain, diving and stuttering with each subsequent report. The executives scrambled. Robert called emergency meetings and tried to spin a narrative of accounting errors and oversight. It was an old playbook. Admit small, promise change, and hope outrage dies down without anyone losing their chair. But evidence is stubborn when it is true. The internal audit matched what I had given Claire. Every misdirect, every shell vendor, every approving signature lined up with what we had presented. The board could not simply sweep it under the rug. The audit told a story that contradicted the company's public face. The suspension notices arrived like paper verdicts. Men and women who had once walked the halls with impunity were suddenly escorted to their cars. Robert's composure finally broke. He was removed from his office in much the same way he had once watched me leave, and the symmetry of that moment felt like a bitter but necessary justice. HR's inquiries shifted from routine to frantic. Fingers pointed, heads ducked. For a moment, the whole company, that complicated organism of ambition and fear, convulsed as if someone had struck it. People who had been complicit by silence now scoured their own memories for plausible deniability. They wanted names. They wanted to know who had leaked to Claire, who had fed the board. Their investigators followed every lead inward, not outward. HR prepared memos and legal counsel, prepared defenses, and somewhere between those memos, my identity began to crystallize in their files. They eventually traced threads that led back to me. It was inevitable. Once a story is big enough, the machine claws at itself to find the origin. I had expected this. I had counted the cost of discovery. I also knew the timing. By the time they reached my door, much of the public damage was already done. I ignored the calls at first. The emails were a chorus of apology and threat, legal speak and pleas. They asked for meetings, retractions, a chance to explain what had happened. If they were sincere, they hid it well. But sincerity felt like a poor currency in a place that had trafficked in deception for so long. Claire wanted to meet in person, to verify details, to ask the tough questions that would make her piece undeniably complete. We met in a quiet cafe, not because it was romantic, but because it was practical. Noises cover, coffee as ritual. She had come prepared with a calm directness that made me trust her work. Her questions were blunt. How I found the trail, why I chose to remain anonymous initially, what I wanted now. I answered with facts. I did not tell her about the cold of the elevator or the cardboard box. Those were personal fractures that did not belong in an inquiry, but they shaped my resolve in ways she didn't need to catalog. Once the audit's findings hit the public square, regulators took notice. There were subpoenas, offers from law firms, and the kind of legal choreography that fills the pages of business journalism. Nexora's PR team tried to muscle a narrative back into shape, but it was too late. The numbers were louder than spin. The company tried to claim they had internal controls and that irregularities were the result of a small group, rogue actors who had acted without corporate sanction. The truth, however, as the audit showed, was systemic. It involved approvals and blind eyes up the chain, an architecture of convenience that enabled fraud. Investors were angry in a way that made boards tremble. Pension accounts and institutional funds who had trusted Nexora demanded answers, and quickly, replacements. Board seats emptied. Regulatory scrutiny turned routine reporting into forensic examination. The scale of the fallout exceeded mere reputational damage. In the midst of that storm, I watched people I once worked alongside scramble for salvage. Some called to apologize, some threatened lawsuits. I received an envelope from a former colleague with a note that said it had hurt to see how far it went. There was guilt and self-preservation mingled in every message. My own life changed in small and practical ways. Offers came from rival firms and compliance-minded startups that wanted someone who knew how to read the underbelly of financial data. I interviewed with people who were blunt about wanting my skills to prevent what had happened at Nexora from happening to them. I accepted a position I had once dreamed of, but never dared to aim for, at a company that valued data integrity and transparency. They didn't ask about the scandal as a test. They saw it as a qualification. My role was clear: build systems that made deception harder and accountability easier. Even as I took that step, there were nights when the past crowded in. I would wake with the feeling of fluorescent lights in my chest, the memory of Robert's voice still echoing. Sometimes revenge is quieter than noise, more a slow settling of facts into the record than the release of wrath. The press, of course, tried to find me. Profiles ran that skirted legality and privacy. People wanted a face to put on the whisper that had become a shout. I did not seek the spotlight, but the truth has a way of making itself visible. Eventually, I agreed to an interview on my terms, not to gloat, but to explain. In that interview, I spoke plainly about motive and method. I said that I did not relish the downfall of colleagues, but that I believed in consequences. I described the careful steps I had taken to ensure evidence would survive corporate countermeasures. I did not brag. I simply narrated the work it took to hold power accountable. Some called me a hero. Others called me reckless, a disruptor who had burned bridges. The labels mattered less than the effect. Governance reforms, new audits, and a wave of internal reviews at companies that suddenly looked at their consultant fees with suspicion. Law enforcement followed with charges against those executives responsible for the siphoning. Criminal cases moved slowly but relentlessly. Plea deals were discussed, reputations fractured, and in some instances, restitution was ordered. The money could not fully return to where it had been, but the law finally acknowledged the theft. Nexora restructured. New leadership came in with the kind of humility that PR consultants often fake, but sometimes people grow into. They adopted reforms that were announced with a fervor that included mandatory audits, vendor verification systems, and a pledge to rebuild trust, one report at a time. Workers at Nexora experienced a strange aftershock. Some who had turned away now felt vindicated. Others who had benefited from the old system found themselves out of favor. Corporate culture shifted the way a river changes course after an earthquake. New banks formed around old currents. People asked me if I regretted anything. I thought about the humiliation I felt, the way my career had been snuffed out, and the slow burn of watching those responsible keep living as though nothing had happened. I also thought of the collateral damage, the innocent people who had been caught by association, the reputations smeared. I had no illusions about the cost. Whistleblowing is not a clean process. It rents your life in unexpected places, privacy, employment, and sometimes citizenship in a community you once called colleagues. But the alternative, quiet complicity, felt like a different kind of theft. I kept copies of everything in multiple places, as if redundancy could be a kind of safety. I slept better, knowing the data could not simply vanish. Proof, assembled and preserved, has a stubborn moral center. It refuses to be rewritten by press releases and smiling executives. Months after the headlines faded, I got an email from someone at the board, an apology thin as tissue paper, but sincere enough. They thanked me for making them see what they had blinded themselves to. They promised changes. The promise felt small, but promises measured in policy and procedure are more durable than words. Claire continued to write. Her follow-ups dug deeper into corporate patterns beyond Nexora, and her byline began to be associated with investigations that led to reform. We stayed in touch occasionally, less as conspirators and more as collaborators who had done the work of unveiling a story that needed to be told. There were legal tangles too. Attorneys wove a web of motions and counterclaims. But by the time the dust settled, the public record had been set. Depositions and board minutes became archival anchors that prevented easy erasure. That, more than anything, is why I chose proof over fury.